author series. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, exploring colonial America, its debt, trade, and tender, and the legacy of its currency. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, and producer of the American Inspiration Series. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Dror Goldberg and his new book, Easy Money, American Puritans and the Invention of Modern Currency. We're fortunate that today Professor Goldberg will present to us in full with illustrations for approximately 35 minutes before he welcomes my colleague, Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming. She will share your questions. Thank you to many of you who sent in your questions in advance as you registered. We got many great ones. If you have additional queries, enter them into the Q&A box at the base of your screen on the right, and Ginevra will get to as many as she can. A video of tonight's program is being made by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The link will be emailed to you in the day ahead when it's available on the American Inspiration Video Archive. Of course, the real education comes from reading Professor Goldberg's comprehensive work published by the University of Chicago Press just a few months ago. Easy Money, American Puritans and the Invention of Modern Currency is available for purchase through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a remarkable work of history based on original research, heralded as a unique window into the history of our country, our currency, and the world. According to the Wall Street Journal, it's the first book-length attempt to explain why a defining concept in our global financial system emerged within a desperate theocracy on the fringes of the British Empire. That theocracy was Massachusetts in the 1690s. If you'd like a signed copy of the book for yourself or as a gift, use the code AMINS23 as you order from Porter Square Books. Now, turning to introductions, Dror Goldberg is a senior faculty member in the Department of Management and Economics at the Open University of Israel. He earned his PhD at the University of Rochester here in the United States, in New York State. Professor Goldberg studies the theory, history, and law of money, particularly legal tender currency. His earlier work on colonial money was published by the Journal of Economic History. Professor Goldberg, we are so glad that you're here with us this afternoon or this evening. You're joining us from Israel, from Tel Aviv, or as I understand, just outside of Tel Aviv. Am I right in saying it's 8 o'clock at night there? Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Oh my gosh. Well, we then thank you, a double thank you to you. And over to you. Let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, okay. So I just wrote an entire book about a single piece of paper. This piece of paper, smaller than your hand, is at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. And it's a historical piece of paper. I will argue that this is the first modern currency. Everybody in the world today uses currency that descends from this piece of paper. Before I get into the talk itself, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of your society. So when I started working on this, one of the happiest days of the period in which I worked on this for more than a decade was when I discovered your register and especially your index. So this is one of the pages from the index, shows the Hutchinson family and in particular Elisha Hutchinson. And I'm very happy and honored today to tell you about my work, including an entire biographical chapter about Elisha Hutchinson, which is the first of its kind. So I'm going to talk about these topics. First of all, I will tell you what I mean by modern currency. Then I will talk about the colonial money before the invention in 1690. It was quite an interesting monetary economy. Then I will talk about the Massachusetts invention, and I will explain why and how it happened. Why it happened? Well, it's because they needed to invent a new type of money. And how were they able to invent a new type of money? Well, these Puritans were pretty remarkable in various ways, and I will focus on their ability. And to demonstrate the ability of these Puritan leaders, I will focus on Elisha Hutchinson, but I will talk about a few more people. So this is my plan for the next 35 minutes. So what do I mean by modern currency? Today, if you look at your paper money, you will see that it says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. The public debts refer both to debts that the government owes us, but most importantly, it refers to our taxes. It means that we can pay our taxes with this paper money. It wasn't always like that. So before the Great Depression, same $5 bill with President Lincoln, it said redeemable in gold on demand. That was before the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, President Roosevelt simply confiscated all private gold, and gold went to Fort Knox, and it remained behind the scenes, somehow backing an increasing amount of paper money. And even this was over one day in 1971. This is the exact moment when President Nixon announced live on TV that he was temporarily suspending the right of foreign central banks to convert paper dollars into gold. Since that day, gold has absolutely no role in our monetary system, and it's like that throughout the world because the anchor of the monetary system until 1971 was the gold in Fort Knox. When Nixon killed that, that was the end of gold. So for 52 years now, we have paper money that is not backed by gold, and it's only legal tender, particularly legal tender for taxes. And the first ones to invent it were the Puritans in 1690, Massachusetts. So that's about modern currency. The invention was in 1690, and it wasn't, as you might expect, just an invention of paper money to replace gold coins or something like that. Not at all. It was a very, very different monetary economy from what most people imagine. So here we have a map of some part of the northern colonies, and the north is on the right-hand side. This is actually New Netherlands, which became New York. You can see here in New Amsterdam. You see a Turkey, which is nice to eat, but the most important thing are these 4 beavers, badly painted beavers. That was the main thing. That was the main reason that New Netherlands was founded. The same goes for Canada. They were founded for beavers. They traded whatever they could with the Indians, and they got the beaver furs and they sent them to Europe, where they were used to produce hats. That's it. That's why you have the United States and Canada in some sense, because of beaver fur hats. And it was also the foundation of Plymouth in the beginning, and it was also projected to be the economic foundation of Massachusetts. It failed to do so, but that was the idea. That's nice, okay. In Virginia, they had tobacco instead as their main production good, their main export. Now, the problem of the colonies was that they didn't have enough English coin. The main English coin was made of silver, and they didn't have enough. Why is that? Because they exported everything they could export, beaver furs in the north, tobacco in the south, and they bought with that from the European ships that visited them. They bought every European manufactured good they could find. So pillows, windows, beds, weapons, papers, pens, everything, because they could not produce anything on their own. So they gave in exchange everything they have, those furs or the tobacco, and they also gave all their coins because they were so desperate. So there were not enough coins for domestic circulation. What did they do? They used the main production good as money itself. So this is presumably or supposedly beaver fur, kind of processed, looks like a coin, that's a coincidence, but it was actually used as money, as official money in all the northern colonies. And in Virginia, they almost immediately after starting growing tobacco, they used tobacco as money. The English colonies in the Caribbean, they used sugar as their most important export good and also as their money. So that was common to all the colonies. Each one used its own production good as money. They also used corn, meaning maize, whenever they could grow it. And that was the normal economy. So everybody used these commodity monies. That's how we economists call them. There was another thing that kind of was different, wampum. It was seashells produced and processed by the Native Americans. Today, there is a dispute between economists and anthropologists whether wampum was only jewelry for Native Americans or also money. The colonists thought it was money, much like economists today, and they adopted it as money within the colonies, among the colonists. And this is quite interesting because for the colonists, it was money that for them had no intrinsic value. They did not use it themselves as jewelry, but they knew that they could always redeem it or convert it into beaver furs held by neighboring Indians or Native Americans. So in some sense, it was like a later banknote. It was some object that had no intrinsic value on its own, but you could convert it into something useful if you just go through the trouble of doing that. So the use of wampum, it was more than a curiosity. It was actually something similar to a banknote redeemable in gold. And that was before England had paper money redeemable in gold. So thanks to the Native Americans and their different aesthetic tastes, they could actually have some progress in monetary theory beyond England. That was quite unusual. That was probably adopted first by Massachusetts and only later by Plymouth and New Netherlands, but we're not sure. In general, however, Massachusetts was definitely the most creative colony. The Puritans were not happy with this primitive system of commodity money, and they tried to come up with improvements. One of their improvisations was bullets. They legalized bullets as small change. It was an armed society. Every man had a gun, so every man had bullets. Everybody had these molds for bullets at home. They simply took lead and turned it into literally balls they could shoot. And they realized, well, everybody had bullets, and it was, in terms of market price, it was close to being a small change. So yeah, let's make it money. So they passed a law only a few years after settling in Massachusetts. They already turned bullets into small change. Massachusetts was also the first to legalize the use of plate or bullion stolen from Spanish ships right after some pirates downloaded their cargo in Boston. Massachusetts was also the first to legalize the use of foreign coin, Spanish coin, Dutch coin, called the dollars. There were pioneers, not only in the general sense, but also in the sense of improving on the primitive system of commodity money. They were, from the beginning, they were ahead of all the other colonies. I will explain later why that was the case. Maybe it's obvious for you. And they were the only ones to open a mint. Massachusetts, unlike Virginia, the earlier colony of Virginia, did not have a right to open its own mint. Virginia had the right, but it couldn't do it because it was so poor. It didn't have the capital to build a mint. It didn't have skilled people to operate it. It didn't have any silver to mint. So it didn't do anything like that. Massachusetts was not allowed to open a mint, but in 1649, as you know, the king lost his head, royalty was abolished. immediately thousands of private businesses in England, chandlers, bar owners, started minting their own coins, small change coins, because they didn't have enough small change. And there was no king around, so everybody could mint their own coins. And Massachusetts followed up on that. And in 1652, it became the only colony to open its own mint. It was rich enough to open a mint. It had nearby ironworks that had the ability both to produce the mint equipment and to lend personnel, qualified personnel to work in the mint. So they were the only ones to open the mint. They continued with the mint long after the restoration of 1660, but eventually the king caught up with that, and the king's officers said this was high treason, nothing less than that, to operate their own mint. Eventually, under pressure from England, Massachusetts closed the mint in 1682. 2 years later, it lost its charter anyway. But throughout the period, it was a pioneering monetary economy. I'm getting close to 1690, which is the climax of the story. But before that, I have to mention something that happened in Canada in 1685. 1685, Canada was in a military emergency. The local governor ran out of silver coins that were supposed to arrive from France. And he paid his soldiers with paper money, actually card money, playing cards. He took playing cards made from cardboard back then. One of the sides was blank, so he wrote his name and signed and date and denominations. This is actually a reconstruction from the 20th century. But it worked. He made a law that everybody, all the sellers in the markets in Quebec City had to accept this and sell goods for it at the normal price, or else he would punish them. And he promised that the cards would be redeemed once he got silver coins from France, and he did. So Canada had paper money before Massachusetts, but this paper money, it was innovative only to the extent that it imported into North America something that had already existed centuries earlier in the old world. China had paper money 1,000 years ago. At first, it was convertible to gold or silver, but the most famous example came from Marco Polo. Everybody in Europe read Marco Polo, and he said very explicitly many times, the occupier, the Mongol ruler, he prints paper money. He doesn't back it with gold or silver. Simply, anyone who refuses to accept it in the markets gets executed. Very simple. In Canada, sellers were not executed, but they were prosecuted and they were punished. It was a criminal offense to reject this money. And something similar happened in Europe, in similar circumstances to those of Canada. Many times there was a siege and on some city or town, and the local commander issued paper money. Here we have a case of Leiden in the United Provinces, the Netherlands. 1574, there was a Spanish siege, so they printed paper money, forced all the sellers to accept it because, you know, it's a military emergency. If you don't want the soldiers to die or mutiny, you better force all the sellers to accept this paper money and sell food to the soldiers. So there were many cases in Asia and Europe of paper money forced under penalty. That's not our paper money. Our paper money is much more liberal. Our paper money is simply legal tender for taxes, and we don't have to accept it under a criminal penalty. So it's something much weaker, something more sophisticated. To summarize, Canada had the first paper money in North America, but that's not the most important thing. The important thing about Massachusetts, which we come to next, is the way this paper was supported. Not by a criminal penalty, not by a promise of gold and silver in the future. So what happened in 1690? Well, there was a war with Canada. It was King William's War, the first war of the English colonies against Canada, part of the bigger Anglo-French War following the Glorious Revolution in England. Canada attacked first, and the English colonies decided to retaliate. One expedition came through land from Albany, led by Fitz John Winthrop. He led forces of Connecticut and New York. They tried to reach Montreal, but they never made it. A larger force, thousands of people on dozens of ships made of Boston and Plymouth, which was still independent, made this very, very long journey to Quebec City. They tried to occupy it. They failed. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no experience in besieging a European town and conquering it. So they sailed back. And it took them 3 months. 3 months was a long time. And it meant that the colony owed lots of money to many, many soldiers. What did they do? First of all, they gave each soldier a debenture. That was standard practice. So a debenture is a single financial instrument given to every soldier. Here it is John Corser, a cook on one of the ships. And he was owed £9, 1 shilling and 6 pence for his service of 3 months. That was nice, and he expected to get silver coins, but there was nothing in the treasury. They raised the taxes 20 times the annual normal amount, but nobody had the ability to pay these taxes immediately. So John Corser and many others were left with these debentures. Maybe they tried to go shopping, but £9, that's huge. That's 3 months' wage. It's very hard to go shopping in one place. They didn't have something like Walmart where you could buy everything, including food. So it didn't work quite well if they tried to go shopping with it. The legislature then said, the General Court of Massachusetts said, well, at least you can pay your taxes with that, because they also owed huge taxes. The same soldiers also had to pay taxes. So they said, well, you can pay your taxes. Maybe it might have encouraged sellers in the stores to accept these debentures, knowing that the sellers could pay taxes with that. That didn't work either. Why? Because it's £9. It's too large. What did they do? Something seemingly very small, but revolutionary. They split these very, very large debentures, named, that could be assigned only by signature, like on a check. They split them into bills. So it says this indented bill. And this bill was 5 shillings. 5 shillings, you can go shopping with that to buy food for a family of 5 for a week. I calculated what you could buy with 5 shillings. And you could get these bills, and it says that the colony owes to the possessor. There's no name on it, so you don't have to assign it on the back with a signature. So this can actually work quite well as hand-to-hand currency. It's small, it has all the formalities of a financial instrument, the indention, the signatures of a committee that issued it, the seal. So it was a financial instrument, like a bond, but it has very, very low denomination. You could actually go shopping with it. And you were promised, and the seller in the store could see the promise that you could pay your taxes with it. It should be accordingly accepted by the treasurer and receivers subordinate to him in all public payments. In our terminology, legal tender for taxes. So legally speaking, this is almost exactly like our currency. So that was the invention, simply accepting the debenture for taxes and then splitting the debenture into smaller round amount. And I call it coining debt. Why do I call it coining debt? Because what is the process of coining or minting? You take a lump of gold that you found in nature and you break it into very small pieces, standardized, anonymous, it doesn't have the name of the possessor, small enough to be convenient in shopping. And that's what they did to the debt itself, to these debentures. They coined the debentures. It's brilliant. Nobody has ever done it before. And this was a revolution in the nature of money. Money no longer depended on being gold or being converted into gold or being forced on sellers to provide goods for paper. It relied on the circulation of money into the treasury and out of the treasury. That's it. You don't need gold when you have taxes. To put it in a different way, taxpayers were owed a very large debt to the government. The government owed a large debt to soldiers. How did they solve the problem? They gave bills to the soldiers. The soldiers went to the taxpayers, who were also sellers. Obviously, everybody sold something, either goods or their labor services. Soldiers received food in a voluntary exchange for their bills. Then these sellers, when they were taxpayers, they gave the bills to the government to pay their taxes. So this circulation worked perfectly well. It could work with a silver coin, it could work with a cow, it could work with paper. So they did it with paper. So that's the invention. Why did they do it? So if they had a mint, why didn't they issue coin? And why didn't they do exactly what Canada did? They had printing presses. They didn't have to use playing cards. They had printing presses. These Puritans really liked to force people to do things. It was a military emergency, just like in Canada. Why did they use coin? Why didn't they use forced paper money as in Canada? So 1690 was a peculiar time. They had lost their charter in 1684, partly because of their independent mint. And as of 1690, Increase Mather was in London lobbying King William to restore the old charter or get a new charter. This was the very brief inter-charter period of Massachusetts. The Attorney General in England told King William, don't give them a charter. Look what they did a few years earlier. They minted their own coins. They violated the royal prerogative. They issued their own coins. So obviously Massachusetts, even if it had a mint, could not risk alienating the king at this particular point by issuing coins. Even issuing paper money like Canada, that was forced on everyone, that also would look too much like money. So they couldn't issue anything that was so blatantly money or too much looking like money. So instead, they came up with this bill. They just call it bill, not paper money, just this commercial financial connotation. It's just an indented bill, an IOU of the colony, and it is not forced on anyone other than the issuer itself. The treasurer issues the money, the treasurer receives it back. That's it. So because of this very particular situation, and I have many circumstantial bits of evidence in the book, they had to come up with something completely new. They couldn't use coins. They couldn't follow the Canadian example, which they were familiar with. They couldn't repeat what Canada did. So they had to come up with something tricky that England will not be upset. So that's why they did it. Now, many governments in the early modern period were bankrupt and couldn't pay their soldiers on time. The results were defections, mutinies, soldiers plundering their own employers. It happened many, many times. Why was Massachusetts able to come up with a solution that left everyone happy? And the soldiers did not have to mutiny, even though they were close to doing so. That's what Cotton Mather tells us. How were they able to solve this particular situation? So the Puritans had quite interesting abilities. As you know, there were religious refugees, unlike the Virginian immigrants who were mostly very poor. The Puritans came for religious reasons, and some of them were poor, but in Massachusetts, with thousands of people, they also included dozens of intellectuals, college graduates, most of them ministers, and dozens of merchants. That's how they started immediately, many of them. And this tradition was preserved all the way to 1690. by two facts. One is Harvard College, that was founded almost immediately. Another is that since the 1640s, Massachusetts, especially the Massachusetts Bay, became the trade hub of English America. So these two classes of intellectuals and merchants, they controlled the colony. They did almost everything. They were not very strong in the governor's position, but they did everything else except for the ministry. Obviously, in the churches, they did everything, and I will show you Elisha Hutchinson's biography, so you'll see what I mean. So this is the main character, Elisha Hutchinson. We think that this is his portrait. We are not quite sure. Actually, there has been some speculation that this was Sir George Downing, a nephew of the Winthrops. And this is not very likely because when Downing was this age, let's say 30s, 40s, he was already in England serving King Charles II, and he was considered the worst traitor in Puritan history because he switched sides after the Restoration and even led to the execution of some regicides. So it is extremely unlikely. So argues art historian Jonathan Fairbanks in this book from 1982. And he says, based on other paintings from the same period by some artists, he says that the most likely candidate is Elisha Hutchinson. This was kind of the uniform of the artillery company of Boston. He says this is probably Elisha Hutchinson, and I found no reason to dispute this assumption. So Hutchinson, why do I focus on him? Because this is the broadside that advertises the issue of paper money. He's the first one mentioned in the order. Elisha Hutchinson, John Phillips is listed second, then Penn Townsend, Adam Winthrop, grandson of the famous John, and Timothy Thornton. This was the committee that issued the paper money. Now, it's interesting that Phillips was the treasurer. You would expect him to lead such a huge financial operation. He was appointed probably because he was Cotton Mather's father-in-law. But no, Elisha Hutchinson, one of the counselors, was appointed to lead the committee. That was hugely significant. I actually looked at all the committees, hundreds of them, before 1690. This was significant. It was not a coincidence. It meant to signal something. On the paper money itself, they preserved the order. Elisha Hutchinson comes first. Now, when you hear the name Hutchinson, probably you think about one of two people. Maybe you think about Anne Hutchinson, the famous religious dissident, co-founder of Rhode Island, famous feminist. Maybe you think about Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the last royal governor, the famous historian. To me, the name Hutchinson, as a foreigner, it really meant nothing. It did ring a bell, but not in a way you think. It reminded me of this. So when I was a kid in Israel in the 1970s, this was my cue to go to bed. I wasn't allowed to watch Starsky and Hutch. So I had to look up who was this guy, Elisha Hutchinson, and I received a lot of help from your register, as I mentioned earlier. So his dynasty is pretty easy to track. He was right in the middle between the famous Anne and the famous Governor Thomas. They spanned the entire colonial period, and he was right in the middle. So I call him the Middle Hutchinson, right in the middle. He's not very well known. You hear a lot about Anne and Thomas, but there was actually nothing about him wherever I looked. If you look at this remarkable book by Gary Boyd Roberts, you find very interesting details. Actually, I Googled Elisha Hutchinson about a decade ago, and the only thing I found from Google Books was this information. So Elisha Hutchinson descends from his father's side. Through Anne Hutchinson, he descends from King Edward I. From his mother's side, the relation is more distant. It goes to Henry I, a son of William the Conqueror. And from his first wife, Elisha Hutchinson is an ancestor of the Bush presidents. From his second wife, he's an ancestor of FDR. That's quite interesting. That's from a book that was published in cooperation with your society. So I wrote an entire biographical chapter about Elisha Hutchinson. It starts with his father, Edward. Because of the controversy with his mother, Anne Hutchinson, he was a merchant. He was rich, invested in real estate, but he was not very much trusted by the population. So he was a deputy in the lower house of the General Court, only for faraway towns, not for Boston itself. He was killed as a diplomat in King Philip's War. There is a marker, a historical marker near Brookfield called the Wheeler Surprise. It should have been called Hutchinson Surprise. He was ambushed by Native Americans, and Captain Wheeler was wounded, but Captain Hutchinson died from his wounds. And his grave is the first in the graveyard in Marlborough. So you can see there, that's my picture. I visited him. And then Elisha Hutchinson became the main Hutchinson in Boston. Incidentally, he was the tallest man in Boston, and he did a lot of things. I emphasize in red some of the more relevant points to my next slide. He was a merchant. And what I said about the merchants who did everything, well, he was a member of the city council. He was a judge in a municipal court. He was Boston's tax commissioner. He was the commander of Boston's regiment in 1690. He was also a clerk in the market. He was also an officer in a project to establish a bank. He started as a deputy for Boston, later became an assistant, meaning a counselor. He even had some diplomatic experience just before 1690. Why is all this relevant, all these different roles? Well, I showed you this graph earlier. When Hutchinson and his colleagues tried to figure out how to solve this problem with his debts by the sellers and taxpayers and the soldiers and the government, Hutchinson knew everything because he was in the government. He was in the council, which was the executive. The council was also the upper house of the legislature. He was a merchant. He was a taxpayer. He was a tax commissioner. He was the commander of all of Boston's soldiers. He knew everybody's point of view, perspective, financial interest. He knew everything. He was in all these positions at a very particular point in 1690. He could figure out how to solve the problem and leave everyone happy. That's why I focus on Hutchinson. That's why I went through the trouble of writing his biography to show that these merchants who did everything could get this very unique perspective, maybe nothing like it in history, that enabled these Puritans to come up with a new type of money. Another point is that his dynasty was extremely adventurous. This financial operation that he led could have resulted in inflation, mutiny, many things. And if you think about, just talk about his grandmother and grandson, this was a very adventurous adventurous dynasty to the point of recklessness. So both Anne and Governor Thomas were banished and soon died in exile. Both Anne and Edward died by Native Americans whom they trusted. It was a very adventurous, even reckless dynasty, and what Hutchinson did by leading this financial operation, it fits exactly in this pattern. I won't talk too much because I'm running out of time. In public history today, Elisha Hutchinson is not well known. He's mentioned only because he's buried with his second wife and her first husband. Her first husband, merchant John Frick, he was killed in a freak accident. A ship exploded in Boston Harbor and killed him. His widow, Elizabeth, married Elisha Hutchinson. Then, when she died, she asked to be buried with her first husband. Hutchinson did not prevent it, but when he died, he requested to be buried with them. So now you have this threesome buried together under a slab in Boston's downtown, at the Granary Burying Ground. And I went to visit them a month ago. This is the concrete slab. And obviously I honored Hutchinson's memory, probably I'm the first to do so, with the legal tender money of the US. I thought it was appropriate. So that's Elisha Hutchinson. Briefly to mention other people, Samuel Seward, the most famous diarist of that period. He was also a merchant. He was also a counselor, but he was also a scholar. The exact form and the text of the bill was written as a draft by him. We have this in the Massachusetts archives. That was his handwriting. It is very peculiar handwriting. It's more legible than anyone else's. So I can say for sure that's his handwriting. And I can figure out why he was involved. He was a merchant like Hutchinson. He did many things. He was also a scholar. He was a Harvard graduate. He studied Aristotle and Plato and the contemporary Thomas Hobbes, all of whom gave hints that paper money could be made of paper, that money could be made of paper, and it could be supported by accepting it for taxes. They studied these people at Harvard. Another one who studied at Harvard was obviously Cotton Mather, was already faculty by 1691. When some of the population doubted whether this experiment could work, he immediately published a pamphlet and said, well, that's nothing, you're just paper money like Canada. He knew he was lying. 6 years later, he wrote, so this is something new. He admitted after the fact, it may serve as an example for any people in other parts of the world whose distresses may call for a sudden supply of money. So this was an incredibly accurate prophecy from Cotton Mather, who would have loved to make correct prophecies. This was right on the mark, because today we all use Massachusetts money. Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey adopted the exact same shape of paper money 20 years later in the next war with Canada. And later, the American Revolution was financed by paper money, legally supported somewhat differently. Then the French Revolution and the British themselves adopted legal tender paper money. Eventually, this became the new standard. From 1800, it was clear to everyone, this is how you finance war. The American Civil War, both sides printed the legal tender paper money, greenbacks and graybacks, and that became the new standard. Nobody ever again debased their gold coins to pay for war. That was totally obsolete. Everyone did like Massachusetts. And after the shocks of the 20th century, 2 world wars and the Great Depression, gold went completely out the window. And now we have, just to wrap up the story, we are back at what Massachusetts did in 1690. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Goldberg, for your fantastic and fascinating presentation. I don't think any of us will ever look at money the same way again. So now let's get to your questions in the audience. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Professor Goldberg, please enter it into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. And as Margaret mentioned at the top of the hour, we did receive several questions prior to the program. So we can get to a few of those. One registrant asked how this, or if it coincided with the development of banks and banking.
Yes, so I mentioned earlier that Elisha Hutchinson tried to, was an officer in a project to establish a private bank. So that was just a few years before that. The problem was that there was the dominion of New England. The bank was based on land titles. People were supposed to mortgage their land title and receive a small denomination paper money from the bank itself. It was a very hot financial idea in the English Empire. The problem was that the Dominion had a dictator, Governor Sir Edmund Andros, if you remember the name, and he invalidated all the land titles. So you can't have a land bank when you don't have any land titles. So this project was aborted in 1688. This is really close by. I think that if they didn't have that problem, they would have backed the paper money with land, because they had 2 bank projects in the 1680s, 2 land bank projects. They would have done that. So I didn't have time to get into that, but I have a lot about it in the book, saying that that was another option that they simply couldn't use because what Governor Andros did, it was overruled by England only in 1691 as part of the new charter. So 1690 was a very, very particular year. If everything had happened a year or 2 later, it would have looked very different.
We also received some questions about counterfeiting. And did you see a rise in your research in counterfeiting during this time?
Yes, so there was very quickly counterfeiting, much more so in the 18th century. I end the story pretty much right after the invention. There was a slight tweaking about it in 1692, and that's when I kind of stopped looking at the details. Obviously, yeah, it was counterfeited. That's why they had these, they had the seal of the colony and the 3 signatures and the indentation at the top. They knew that people would forge these things. Actually, one of the few surviving bills, so I showed you the only one from December 1690. There was another bigger batch from February 1691. One of those simply was changed, I think, from 2 shillings to 20 shillings. We simply added a 0. So yeah, you know, it's human nature, nothing new under the sun. As soon as the opportunity arose, people did it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any tips? I know several people listening, I'm sure, have colonial ancestry, and they may see tender amounts, especially in probates or inventories. If you wanted to understand how much that currency is worth in current terms, any kind of tools or tips that you can share?
There is a website of the Economic History Association. It is called measuringworth.com or .org, I don't remember, measuring worth, and you can translate the values of old money into today's terms. So that's what you can do.
Great, great. Nancy asks, how did the use of lead tokens fit into the economy? Or did they?
Token. So if you refer to the bullets, so the bullets were legalized as a small change only. They replaced farthings, a quarter a penny, called the farthing, because England didn't have good farthings made of copper or lead or tin even. They were not trusted by the English public in the 1630s, so Massachusetts outlawed them and decided to use bullets from lead. And actually, the only thing we have is the law made by the General Court, and we don't have any evidence that it was actually used. Evidence about private transactions is very, very rare because people didn't issue receipts for every transaction. So most of what we have is the General Court records, mostly legislative records. Some judicial cases are also very important. We don't know much about private transactions, unfortunately.
Another question, Dorothy asks, were women able to handle money? Can you talk a little bit about the role of women and this currency?
Sure. I suppose that women did much of the shopping, and if they were widows, they were their own households. They had their own households, and yeah, they had as much property rights as any man if there was no man in the household. So yeah, absolutely. Actually, the first evidence we have of a transaction with one of these bills is by Samuel Sewell, not in his famous diary, but in some of his papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society. A few days after the bills were issued, he sells some timber for a widow, probably a widow from the same war, for 10 shillings in the bills of credit. So that's the first evidence.
And this may go outside of the period that we're focused on. I'm not quite sure, but Carol asks, while going through paper from my grandparents, there were pieces of paper called chit, C-H-I-T. What is this? Is that a possible type of currency?
I'm not familiar with that name. Maybe it's a later period.
Okay. Let's see, a few other questions. You talked a lot about kind of the transition from the bartering system to the currency exchange. I mean, do you still see bartering going on just as a matter of everyday life after this currency is introduced?
So we don't have a lot of evidence, as I said, about private transactions. You could say that some of the taxes at some point resembled barter. So in 1690, just before the paper money was issued, you could pay your taxes in pork and beef and maize and barley and rye and all sorts of commodities. And it probably reflected that the private economy was doing some barter as well. But I don't have direct evidence because these transactions were almost never documented.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about some of the records that you did use for your work and for your research.
So as I said, it's mostly the general court records. It's a problem if you want to know how money functioned in the society, but as I said, this is the most reliable and almost the only source of records we have. Private records were few and most of them did not survive. It's a problem to claim that what we have in the general court records exactly reflects the private economy, but my book is not about the private economy. My book is about how a government designed a new type of money that relied on the government. It's legal tender for taxes. So I convinced myself that for this purpose, it's okay to focus on general court records and not worry too much that it does not reflect the private economy. For my purposes in this specific book, that was good enough.
Leslie asks, how did they handle change from a transaction using paper money? Could they issue paper money as change? Or did it have to be exact?
So anybody could issue IOUs. They used a lot of book credit. So that actually saved on the use of cash at all. So we didn't have a problem with with needing small change if you could write the debt in your account book and settle it later when it accumulated to a large amount. So yeah, small IOUs, small silver coins, they still had these around. The coins, by the way, some of them were still around. The coins range from 2 pence to 1 shilling. And the paper money started at 1 shilling. So they still had some coins around and the paper money just went above that, like you have with coins and paper money today. So they still had some coin for small change. And they could also use some corn. It was still legal tender for taxes. It was still valuable as a commodity. They could just give some small bag of corn for small change.
Right. We were talking earlier about how for many of us, colonial America, colonial New England is literally in our blood. It's down the street, it's around the corner. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to this topic and kind of what sparked your interest in this, in the birth of this currency, as well as the birthplace being in Massachusetts?
Sure. So I'm an economist by training, also a legal scholar, but mostly an economist. And I became familiar with this theory that our money functions without gold only because it is legal tender for taxes. So I looked into the theory of that and I did what economists do, mathematical models and all that. And then I came across a quote from Adam Smith, who was born actually on this day 300 years ago. Exactly. And he says, well, these American colonies are using this kind of paper money before everyone else. Nobody else does that except for the American colonies. So I went to read about American paper money and everybody pointed to Massachusetts. The interesting thing is that everyone said, I think Americans focused on the fact that this was the first paper money, the first American paper money, not the first paper money in America because there was Canada, but the first American paper money in the sense of the US. And I think Americans missed the point that it held this very peculiar legal status during war, and that was the first in monetary history. They didn't simply force the money on everyone and promise to get gold later. They used a very, very peculiar legal mechanism that exists today and was totally new back then. So that's what got me to doing this research. I found that many colonial historians knew about this paper money. They didn't realize how innovative it was. So there was this question here in the Q&A. I mean, yeah, it was not the first paper money, but in history, not the first paper money in North America even, but it was the first modern currency, money that is not related to gold and is legal tender for taxes.
Great. Well, I'm glad that that interest was sparked and you looked into it for our sake. But thank you for answering all those questions. Thank you everyone for your questions. As we do for each author in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Professor Goldberg to read to us briefly from his book. And so I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So in 1801, a German economist defined the 18th century not as the century of enlightenment, but as the paper century. I suggest that the Enlightenment and the rise of paper money were not parallel, unrelated phenomena. The most enlightened American, Boston-born Benjamin Franklin, was a lifelong printer, promoter, scholar, and legislator of paper money of various types. That was the only area in which he was active throughout his adult life. Scotland, a powerhouse of enlightenment, was also a paper money pioneer. Its most famous economists, David Hume and Adam Smith, supported Scottish paper money. They objected to America's paper money long after it became inflated and defamed. Much earlier, another Scotsman, William Paterson, proposed to England the issue of legal tender banknotes. This proposal mutated into the Bank of England notes. Another Scotsman, John Law, made the most daring paper money experiment in France, the epicenter of the Enlightenment. The rational invention of 1690 Massachusetts marked the beginning of the end of gold and silver as money, shattering the ancient common sense notion that money must be metallic. Ironically, that monetary enlightenment was manifested in getting rid of those materials that for the most part have excelled only in reflecting light. The true light was that the general court used reason to design a new concept of money. Enacted by an assembly, Massachusetts legal tender money constituted local liberation from royal regulation, a major Enlightenment goal. Another key Enlightenment feature, a belief in progress, was present as well. As Cotton Mather stated in 1697, their invention could fundamentally improve the public finance of any state that paid attention to the distant city upon a hill. It may serve as an example for any people in other parts of the world whose distresses may call for a sudden supply of money to carry them through any important expedition. The monetary revolution that happened in Massachusetts not only created modern currency, it should also be considered as one of the many beginnings of the intellectual movement that created the modern world.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldberg. The creation of our money system as an intellectual and an Enlightenment innovation, as a print invention. Of course, those of us who love books and learning and reading and history, we absolutely love that. So thank you for that reading, and thank you for your presentation. And Ginevra, thank you for your great Q&A. As a reminder to our audiences, copies of Easy Money, American Puritans, and the Invention of Modern Currency are available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Use the code AMINST23 as you order, and Porter Square Books will mail you a copy at any speed you want in any direction. As you can see from Professor Goldberg's presentation and the Q&A, Easy Money is history meets academics, and it's truly fascinating. It's pleasure reading the study of America and economics, and you'll be seeing it on coffee tables and as well on college and grad school curriculums. Moving toward closing, we at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's author talk. If you're researching a time in history, a person, or a family, please think of us and our resources. NEHGS members can access our digital archives and databases, 1.4 billion searchable records any time of day or night, free to the public. You can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs, such as this one for family historians. You can see in what's listed on screen that we cover all sorts of topics, places, and times, in-person events and online events. Our mission simply is to educate, inspire, and connect. We hope we've done that today. To connect with us in person around our favorite topic, history, family history, join us in Philadelphia on July 27 for a family history benefit dinner at the Museum of the American Revolution. We'll be honoring the multi-Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian Alan Taylor. The topic of this summer family history benefit will be the immigration revolution in British America, 1600 to 1800. Your ticket for this elegant dinner, celebratory dinner, includes access to the museum and its exhibits during the reception time. So do think to join us, particularly if you're down in that area. And for you literary sorts, join us for more author talks, of course, in the American Inspiration series. On June 20, the day after Juneteenth, we're exploring the celebrated biography of MLK Jr. Jonathan Eig, the author of King, A Life, will be joined by Peniel Joseph of the University of Texas at Austin. You may have seen this book on the cover of the New York Times Book Review last Sunday. It's quite a work, actually 2 Sundays ago. This new biography provides insights into MLK's life based on a new trove of documents, many of them from just released FBI files. With partners at the Boston Public Library, the Museum of African American History, and GBH Forum Network, we look forward to welcoming you to this free online book talk in celebration of Juneteenth, that important American holiday. On July 11, in a ticketed event, we're hosting the celebrated chef and nephew of the cook, Julia Child. Alex Prudhomme will present his wonderful new book, Dinner with the President, Food, Politics, and a History of Breaking Bread in the White House. He'll be joined by Amy Traverso of Yankee Magazine, our partner for this event, Yankee Magazine. Together, they'll go through the history of dining with the president all the way back to George Washington at Valley Forge. Join us to learn how, in the words of Stanley Tucci, the presidential palate has helped shape America. And on July 18th, we'll welcome Lee Myers with her intimate and unflinching nonfiction book, Thinning Blood, a memoir of family, myth, and identity. In it, she excavates the stories of 4 generations of women. Her goal is to leave a record of her family, as she may be the last member of the Jamestown Slalom tribe in her family line due to her tribe's strict blood quantum laws. For this, we'll be joined by partners at Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network. And now back to this afternoon, to this presentation, truly winding down. Thank you, Professor Goldberg. Truly, thank you. And to Ginevra Morse behind the scenes for this highly informative program, for your research knowledge, both of you, and both of your insights. Thank you also to my colleague, Kelly Neagle, behind the scenes, and to the audience out there in Zoomland. Thank you. We are grateful to you for tuning in at all times of day, for your questions, for your interest in history. We hope to see you soon again. For now, we wish you a good afternoon and good evening to you, Professor Goldberg in Israel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.